All right, well, welcome to our final part of Soren Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, Part 5. And in this one, we turn to the problematas. There are three problematas that are raised at the end, and they actually are a good chunk of the book. But the material that we discussed up until this point is actually a little bit more important. These sections we can move through relatively easily and quickly. And so let's start with the first problemata, which raises the question, is there a teleological suspension of the ethical? And so before we can answer that question specifically, we have to look at the word teleology for anyone who may not be familiar with that term. Teleology is the study of ends or goals. And so what is the end goal? What's the ultimate purpose of our activity? What is it that we're trying to achieve? And so when we think about the ethical sphere, we know that as human beings, we are expected to act in a morally upright fashion and so on. But is there anything beyond that point? Or is that the end goal? For example, in Aristotle's philosophy, which is perceived as a teleological ethics, the end goal, eudaimonism, is happiness. And so the purpose of a moral existence is to attain that state of happiness. Happiness, he says, doesn't make any sense to raise the question, why would you want to be happy? What's that supposed to lead you to? Because it's the end goal, it's the end point. Well, for many people, ethics itself seems to be perceived as an end in its own right. Kierkegaard wants to know, is there anything beyond that? Is there a suspension of the ethical? Ultimately, are the actions of Abraham ethical? So Kierkegaard is questioning Abraham's actions. He wants to know, are these ethical? How would they be viewed ethically if they are? And in questioning Abraham's answers, he contrasts them with the story of Agamemnon. Agamemnon offended the Greek gods, and because of this, he was required to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia in order to set sail and save his country during the Trojan War. His sacrifice became well known and praised. As a tragic hero, Agamemnon remains well within that ethical realm. His decision is basically a utilitarian decision. Agamemnon sacrifices the one, his daughter, for the good of the many. And so, in essence, Agamemnon is put, much like Abraham, in a very difficult situation. He has his daughter, who he loves, who he cares about, but at the same time, he has offended the gods and he's being punished. He needs desperately to escape from this island so that he can return home and save his men, save his kingdom. But the gods will not let him escape from this island without him making this sacrifice of his daughter. Now he has to make a very difficult decision. What is going to be of greater value to him? The life of Iphigenia or the life of his people, his kingdom? And we can agree with Agamemnon's decision or we can disagree with it. There are many people who would argue that he made the right choice by sacrificing one to save the many. But there are others who would argue that Agamemnon's decision was wrong because the life of one person is just as precious and just as important as the life of the many. And we can have that type of disagreement, but that doesn't mean that his action is outside of morality. It is well within the confines of morality, because as we learned in Aristotle, morality equates to rationality. And so for an action to be considered a moral decision, an ethical decision, we have to be able to understand it, to comprehend it. It has to make sense. And we can look at this. We can see Agamemnon as being a person of good moral character because he agonizes over this decision. It's not something that comes easily to him. But in the end, Agamemnon makes that choice. He makes that decision to sacrifice his daughter for the sake of his kingdom. This is the type of situation that individuals have to face. For example, at the end of the Second World War, President Truman had to make the decision as to whether he was going to use the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And we know from all accounts that this was not an easy decision. We know he agonized over it for a long time. But in the end, he made essentially a utilitarian decision. He chose to put the needs of the many over the needs of the few. Because while dropping that bomb is going to be devastating, 50,000 of the enemy could be destroyed through that one bomb. If he doesn't do that and end the war immediately, then this war is going to drag on probably another 2 years. Millions of people are going to be killed on both sides. And so while it is greater odds, greater numbers, it's still the idea that he made a decision, a rational decision, to put the needs of the many over the needs of the few. And so we can understand what's being done. It's rational. It can be justified. Whether we agree with it or not, we can understand the decision that's being made. There's something that we can point to and say Agamemnon chose to sacrifice his daughter for this reason. And so it stands within the moral sphere. There's a purpose behind it. There's an end goal behind it. But when we look at the case of Abraham, that situation is very different. Abraham goes beyond the realm of the ethical to a higher telos, to a higher end. Abraham doesn't act to save his people. He doesn't act to protect the state. Abraham doesn't do anything that he can point to and say, here is where I chose to sacrifice Isaac for the greater good. What Abraham did was to make a personal choice. His greatness is found in the personal, not in the moral virtue. So unlike Agamemnon, whose exploits and whose sacrifices are very well known, Abraham can't actually tell anyone what it is that he did. Abraham can't justify himself in the way that Agamemnon does by saying, the future will prove me right. Because if Abraham's actions are wrong, then ethically he's just a murderer, or at least an attempted murderer. But if he's right, then there must be something higher than the ethical. The ethical may be suspended for a higher purpose. The paradox that's being created here is called the virtue of the absurd, because it recognizes the paradox that only the absurd is a reasonable choice, since reason has to be suspended and subjective passion has to be embraced. Listen to the way that Kierkegaard explains this. In the time before the outcome, either Abraham was a murderer every minute, or we stay with the paradox, which is higher than all mediation. So Abraham's story contains a teleological suspension of the ethical. He has, as the single individual, become higher than the universal. This is the paradox which cannot be mediated. How he got into it is just as inexplicable as how he stayed in it. If this is not how it is with Abraham, then he is not even a tragic hero, but a murderer. To want to go on calling him the father of faith, to talk of this to those who are only concerned with words is thoughtless. A tragic hero can become a human being by his own strength, but not the knight of faith. When a person sets out on the tragic hero's admittedly hard path, there are many who would lend him advice. But he who walks the narrow path of faith, no one can advise, no one understand. Faith is a marvel, and yet no human being is excluded from it. For that in which all human life is united is passion, and faith is a passion. So, in Kierkegaard's estimation, there is certainly a teleological suspension of the ethical, There is certainly this idea in which we can move beyond it, but it means taking that embrace of the subjective viewpoint. It means jumping past what is explainable, what is understandable, and operating just on that realm of faith and nothing more. The second problemata that is raised is there an absolute duty to God? Is there a sense in which we owe an absolute duty, an absolute obligation to God himself? And here's the opening lines of this problemata. The ethical is the universal, and as such, in turn, the divine. It is therefore correct to say that all duty is ultimately duty to God. But if one cannot say more, one says, in effect, that really I have no duty to God. The duty becomes duty to God by being referred to God, but I do not enter into a relationship with God in the duty itself. So ultimately, what we're going to find is that, yes, there is an absolute duty to God, but that duty comes through a subjective choice, through an ultimate decision. In this second problemata section, Abraham is going to be seen as the knight of faith. As a knight of faith, Abraham is going to violate his ethical duty to follow his established moral norms in order to obey his duty to God. Now this, as we saw, contrasts with the tragic hero like Agamemnon, who remains firmly entrenched within the ethical community. In other words, the contrast here is between the person who acts in an extraordinary way, bringing attention to himself in the objective world of moral standards, and the man who transcends these social mores to walk on a higher subjective plane of existence. Agamemnon is that one who brings attention to himself. Look at the sacrifice that he's making in slaying his daughter Iphigenia. And he's doing it for you. He's doing it for the kingdom, for the people. And so he's bringing attention to himself through that activity. Look at this morally upright person that I am. Look at the sacrifice that I'm willing to make for my kingdom. But Abraham does everything that he does in silence. Abraham is outside of that ethical community. He is not there to bring attention to himself and say, look at what I'm doing. He can't really even tell anybody what he's doing. So Abraham is far beyond the notion of a tragic hero. The tragic hero, like Agamemnon, can be understood. His sacrifice can be noted and appreciated by the ethical community that he's a part of. The tragic hero becomes a hero because of the actions that he's performed, which invite our admiration and respect. But Abraham is not the tragic hero. He doesn't seek any type of external approval. He doesn't tell anyone what's been commanded or what he intends to do, because Abraham's relationship is not with the ethical community. He's moved beyond that. He's transcended beyond it. Abraham's relationship is now with God alone. So ultimately, there is no reasonable explanation that any other person would be able to appreciate for why Abraham acted as he did. His duty to God was the reason for his choice. Abraham held steadfast to that duty, and he would do so even if it meant being misunderstood, even if it meant being shunned, even if it meant being locked away and punished. He will hold firmly to that duty. Because ultimately, as we saw before, who is it that's able to understand Abraham? Only Abraham himself. No one else can understand, no one else can comprehend what it is that Abraham has done. He is the only one. And so this brings us to the third and final problemata, which raises the question, was it ethically defensible of Abraham to conceal his purpose from Sarah, Eliezer, and Isaac? Now, I would point out that this question really only applies from the traditional Christian reading of the text. Within the Islamic tradition, within the Jewish tradition, this wouldn't be an issue, because in those versions, Abraham is very open with Isaac, at least, with regards to what's going to happen. Within the telling of the story in the Quran, Abraham gets up and tells Isaac, I've had this vision, I've had this dream that I am to take you to the mountaintop and offer you for sacrifice. And Isaac says, if it's the will of Allah, then so be it. In the Jewish Midrash stories, we're told that Abraham is honest, he's open with Isaac, and tells him that this is what it is meant to be. And in one of those stories, Isaac even says, make sure that you bind me tightly so that I don't jerk away out of reflex and do harm to this sacrifice. Because again, Isaac seems to be willing to die for Kiddush Hashem. He's willing to die for the glorification of God, for the name, for the holy name. But within the Christian tradition, where we perceive Isaac as this young child, where we see him being taken and led by his father, where only these couple brief lines of dialogue are found within Genesis. We've got the wood and the firestone, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham says, God will provide the lamb, my son. And that's the only thing that's said between them within Genesis. And so from that Christian perspective, this becomes an important question, because Abraham doesn't tell Sarah, he doesn't tell Eliezer, he doesn't tell Isaac, he doesn't tell anyone. And so this question, is it right to remain silent on this issue, becomes important really within that Christian context that Kierkegaard is operating from within. Well, to answer this question, Kierkegaard is going to return again to the figure of Agamemnon to try to understand the tragic drama. He says that in a tragic drama, concealment of the information and then the recognition of that resolving factor, why the hero acts the way they do, these are essential elements to the story. The actions of the tragic hero are always going to be in line with ethics. Again, you may agree with the decisions that he makes, you may disagree with the decisions that he makes, but yet the reader is always going to be able to understand the actions. The reader will always understand the reasoning behind why the hero does this thing. And he'll be able to relate to those actions, because the tragic hero, like Agamemnon, takes his actions openly. Everyone sees what he's doing. We can enter into the thought process. We can understand rationally why he's making the decision that he's making, whether we agree with it or not. But Abraham does not explain his actions. He doesn't really even speak. And Kierkegaard goes on to understand, or to explain, rather, that even if Abraham wanted to speak, he wouldn't be able to, because his actions are not understandable. They don't exist within the ethical sphere. They stand outside of morality. As we saw earlier, from a moral standpoint, Abraham is perhaps a lunatic. Abraham is perhaps a murderer or attempted murderer. But within the confines of faith, he transcends beyond all of that. But we are not in that realm of faith. We are not seeing things through his eyes. We don't experience his subjective reality. And so we are not able to understand Abraham. In doing this, Kierkegaard is basically recognizing one of the central problems of religion in general. He says, Abraham is silent, but he cannot speak. Therein lies the distress and the anguish. For if when I speak, I cannot make myself understood, I do not speak, even if I kept talking without stop night and day. This is one of the problems that we run into with religious studies in general, is that we are using language which is a human construct. We created language based upon the things around us so that we could be able to communicate with each other as social creatures. But yet, when we're talking about something that goes beyond our human experience, that stretches to the eternal, that stretches to the divine, then what we're really doing is trying to use human language to explain things that can't be understood in human language. And that's why there is so much discrepancy. And so Abraham is remaining silent because he understands that even if he were to be able to explain this issue, that it wouldn't be understood properly, that it would be misinterpreted. There ultimately is no way for Abraham to have been open. There's no way he could have spoken to anybody or made his actions understood. Abraham stood alone on that mountaintop. His faith alone allowed him to act on the paradox that by sacrificing Isaac, he will be able to keep Isaac. Abraham can come to that understanding through his own subjective experience, but it's not something that anyone else would comprehend. The idea that's being presented here is one that a later 20th century philosopher called Ludwig Wittgenstein is going to advocate as well. In 1919, he published a book called the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. And the final line of that basically says that of what we cannot speak, we must pass over in silence. And it seems that Wittgenstein's notion is in agreement with Kierkegaard on this, that many times the things that are most relevant, most important to us are things that are beyond the confines of human language to comprehend, to understand, to share. And so they are things that can only be known through the experience of having them. Abraham has had that experience that no one else on the planet ever has. And so he has experienced it. He has that understanding. But the rest of us do not. And so he can try to come up with all of these words to try to express these concepts, to try to express the ideas, to try to make us understand. But it's not going to happen. Again, it's very much like that scene in the Gospel of Thomas, where Jesus takes Thomas aside and reveals secret knowledge to him. And the other disciples want to know what that knowledge is. And Thomas says, well, if I told you even one of the things that I was told, you'd pick up stones and kill me now for blasphemy. It's not that what Jesus told Thomas is blasphemy, but it's if I tried to put what was given to me through this gnosis, through this experience, into words, I would jumble everything up. I'd not be able to get the ideas across. Why do you think that Jesus, when he speaks to the masses, always speaks in parables? He doesn't come right out and say, here is what you need to know, because the language isn't adequate for that. But maybe through a parable, I can get you to start thinking and preparing your way to make the leap of faith to where you can understand it properly. And so Kierkegaard is playing upon all of those notions, upon all of those ideas. Anyway, it's another passage here for you. He makes the infinite movement of resignation and gives up his claim to Isaac, something no one can understand because it's a private undertaking. But then he further makes, and at every moment is making, the movement of faith. This is his comfort, for he says, nevertheless, it won't happen. Or if it does, the Lord will give me a new Isaac on the strength of the absurd. This is the type of reasoning that's going on, and it's one that doesn't make any type of sense to a rational person. How could it be that by giving up what I love the most, I'm going to get to keep what I love the most. That's a paradox. I mean, how is it possible that even if Isaac were killed upon the mountaintop, I would be given a new Isaac in his stead? That's a paradox. It's an absurdity. And from that Hegelian standpoint of reason and logic, it makes no sense whatsoever, therefore it cannot happen. But through the subjective embracing of faith, we transform what is impossible into what is probable. The absurdity is accepted. So, in the conclusion of this, we find that Abraham is not a hero. His tragic destiny is never made clear. What Abraham is a paradox, right? Just like these other paradoxes we've talked about, Abraham is himself a paradox. And as such, he can only be understood in the way that paradoxes are understood, which means he can't be understood. Paradoxes cannot be understood. They cannot be resolved. They simply have to be accepted as unintelligible. In simplest terms, faith is not something that can be mediated. Paradoxes are not able to be understood or resolved. That's why they're a paradox. The absolute paradox, the idea that the eternal could enter into time without destroying itself, from a rational standpoint is absurd. It makes no sense. But yet, through that leap of faith, by accepting the unintelligible, simply on faith, we're able to recognize the idea that God could enter into time, could join with us, could elevate us to that higher plateau that we want to be in. That God could come into this world and share this knowledge and this wisdom with Abraham, with Moses, and so on. This sense of faith is then the ultimate, is the absolute. There is nothing that is there beyond or that is higher than faith. So yes, we can transcend beyond the ethical. Yes, it is perfectly acceptable for Abraham to remain silent and not tell anyone, because that too recognizes his understanding that he is a paradox, that he is dealing with a paradox. And so through his subjective leap of faith, he can embrace and understand what we never will, because we've never been put in that situation. And so in the epilogue, we find the text concluding very much in the way that it began. It's poking fun at the Hegelian and Descartes' tradition, that 400-year-long cul-de-sac, as he calls it. He pokes fun at all those people now who want to move beyond faith, right? They'll say, well, if the ethical can be transcended, then why can't faith be transcended? And Kierkegaard says very simply, because faith is the highest passion in a human being. There is nothing beyond it. Faith is the highest passion in a human being. And for Kierkegaard, faith is both the end and the continuing challenge for all. Well, I hope that you have enjoyed learning about Kierkegaard. He's a very fascinating individual, and there's a lot of rich things within this text. So I hope that these videos have helped you to understand those and to appreciate those.